Hi again, everybody. This is PowerPoint number 3. Our focus of this PowerPoint is on methods and approaches in teaching English as a foreign or English as a new language. And I'm excited to dig into the different historical methods that have been used and then also reinforce our current methodology, which we introduced in the last PowerPoint. So in this PowerPoint, I will be talking about some historical traditions of teaching languages, including the grammar translation method, the audiolingual method or ALM, the natural approach, TPR or total physical response, and then moving into what we introduced in the last PowerPoint, communicative language teaching and current teaching methodology or pedagogy for today. Okay, so let's jump right in. So I have some reflection questions for you to think about before you begin this module. The first one is just thinking about your personal experience as a language learner. I hope all of you have attempted or have succeeded at trying to learn another language or 2 or 3. So my question is, what were your impressions and what is your assessment of the effectiveness of the approaches that you have encountered as a learner? And what language methodology do you think you would like to focus on and learn to use for your future teaching, and why? Okay, let's go ahead. So long ago, when language study really began, the grammar translation method was the methodology that was most in favor. And it was used by language teachers for many years until the late 19th century. Often referred to as the classical method because it was really used, especially around the classical languages like Latin and Greek. And its purpose was really helping students read and appreciate foreign language literature and, of course, translate literature. So the method has these 2 goals: to enable students to read and translate literature written in another language. And the idea was this was for the stimulation and growth of students' intellectual development by getting access to written texts from other languages. The grammar translation method, though, stuck around for a long time. Classes, like you can see in this picture, were taught in the student's native language. So the classes would be primarily taught in English with very little use of the language, target language that students were studying. But there was this constant comparison between the first language, in this case, English, and the first language, would be English of most students, and the second language of other learners. Vocabulary was really isolated word lists, often decontextualized or not even thematically grouped. There was elaborate explanations of grammar. Reading of difficult text was introduced early on in the course of study. While little attention was paid to content of the text or what students thought of the text, it was really like a translation exercise to understand and decode the language. So there are very few opportunities for listening and speaking practice. Most of the class time was devoted to talking about the language rather than talking in the language. So I'm wondering if any of you have experienced this type of methodology for learning a language. ALM, or the audiolingual method, was the prevailing method of the 1940s and 1950s. And it followed the idea that learning is really conditioning. So while it originated with Army specialized training programs where they were trying to teach languages very quickly, it moved into mainstream classrooms fairly rapidly. So it follows along that behaviorist model of learning that talks about stimulus, response, reinforcement. So through this continuous process of positive reinforcement, it was as if teachers' job was to form habits in their learners. So rather than having the focus on acquiring language, it was really habit forming. So lots of substitution drills, like conjugations of verbs. I feel like I've experienced this even in my own learning. For example, I had a teacher who had the whole chalkboard filled with verbs, and she would hit the chalkboard, each verb, with I think it was a fly swatter. So she would hit that, and the students would go down the rows calling out the forms. So she would say, for example, this was in studying Spanish. So she would say the form, let's say it was the yo form, present tense, and she would start smacking the verbs. and each student would have to say the correct yo form of that verb or the I form of that conjugated verb. So high pressure, a lot of anxiety. I was always waiting. What verb am I going to get? Trying to count ahead. Definitely not good for lowering the effective filter, nor was it communicative in any shape or form. Okay. So a little bit more about the audiolingual method. It really worked on students working with memorized material. So they talk about, especially for the purposes of armed forces, students were never asked to say anything they hadn't seen before or hadn't memorized. So the participants, the students could really have, produce good pronunciation because they were memorized phrases that they had heard and used over and over again. Also a positive is that it included teaching culture with the idea that they were preparing students to deal with situations in the target language community, and that especially applied to the training of armed forces. Part of ALM is a presentation practice production, PPP, and I just want to introduce you to that type of lesson formation. So it is very much a drill and kill type of language methodology, but it is organized into these 3 parts of class, which give a nice structure to class. So there's some things we can take from this to apply later. But PPP is presentation. So the teacher presents the information. The students practice it. And in this case, ALM, it would be like drills, like that verb on the verb with the fly swatter activity that I was subjected to. But then there is a production, which I don't know if my teachers ever got to that part, but production would be where students would apply what they had practiced and what had been presented in something that would be a little bit more authentic, in which they were using the language in their own way, maybe not an authentic context, but at least there was some production as well. And there's a link here if you want to explore more about the PPP, which is, again, a way of framing a lesson, but focuses on that audiolingual method, ALM. So after that, the natural approach came into favor. This was the late 1970s into the 1980s. And it was really based upon Krashen's 5 hypotheses, which you might remember back from PowerPoint. Number 1 was second language acquisition. Krashen, as I mentioned then, was one of the leading, and still is, a leading theorist about language learning. So these 5 hypotheses, which we talked about as being so influential to the field, really formed the basis, the framework of the natural approach. So the natural approach, we're getting closer to what we want, right? There's really a use of TPR, or total physical response, which we'll talk more about in a moment. There's a lot of contextual clues in the classroom. So imagine that there'd be like bulletin boards full of pictures and labels, a lot of language around learners. They incorporate dialogues and paired interviews and even problem-solving activities. All of this sounds pretty good. Games. And in a way, it's a flipped classroom because grammar would be studied outside of class before students came in. And then class time was really supposed to be used for language application. So good stuff. So we began to move on, rejecting behaviorist views of language learning in the favor of rationalism and mentalist perspectives, especially with this attempt to make language learning more natural, more authentic, mirroring the learning of students' first language, really trying to look at how L1 acquisition, how that really is related to L2 acquisition, because there are so many similarities. So incorporating TPR, there's a lot of total physical response, like you can see these students in this class. TPR, if you think about like head, shoulders, knees, and toes, it's incorporating movement with words and vocabulary, or you can even use it to eventually create stories, but at the basic level, it's things like stand up, sit down, turn around, jump, walk, skip, wave hello, any action that you can put a movement with to demonstrate would be a total physical response. This is especially effective with young learners. It's really good with all learners, but young learners in particular, especially if they can demonstrate understanding without having to produce language, right? So you could say stand up, and if they stand up, you know they understood. You say sit down, they sit down. They're showing you that they're starting to acquire language. So this is nice because it follows the way children learn their first language, right? From their parents who are telling them to do things. How do we know they understand? Because they do them. So this is really based upon that idea that we need students to really listen and I'm trying to think of not produce, but just hear and show that they're understanding without having to produce the language, right? It also taps into kinesthetic learning preferences, so movement gets the blood moving. We know that's really good for students as well. It's in the target language almost exclusively, so that's also a positive. And students are exposed to language that's like based on real experiences. They would be hearing commands like stand up, sit down, um, run, jump, skip, etc. So it's also really nice methodology because it reduces stress that people feel when studying languages, helps lower the affective filter. We know that that's good for all ages. It gives students time to listen before they're, encouraged or required to speak or produce language. So there's some really good aspects of this methodology. More about principles of TPR, which I think we've mainly covered. Students' understanding of the target language should be developed before speaking. So again, they're listening first before they produce. They can initially learn one part of language rapidly by moving their bodies. So they're combining listening with movement. Students can be successful relatively quickly in the classroom, and there's a lot of laughter, which lowers the affective filter and lowers anxiety for learning. Language learning is more effective when it's fun. We know that. And also, students really should be expected to make errors. This was one of the founding principles of TPR, that teachers should be really tolerant and accepting of errors, because we know that language acquisition, that students are developing that interlanguage, and that interlanguage might have some gaps or it might have some incorrect information, but they're still trying to respond from the language that they have developed, that system of language in their heads. Okay, then moving back to CLT, we introduced this in the last PowerPoint we had together, and I told you then that it's really the basis of a lot of the teaching of pedagogy that I do at NC State. So after we talk about the historical developments of language teaching, CLT is really our gold standard for what we want to see all teachers doing in every single class when they're working with learners. So remember that CLT focuses on communicative competence rather than grammatical correctness. Grammar is still important, but it is not the primary focus. Really, the primary focus is building fluency and having students experiment with language, use language in new ways to try out things, and then receive feedback from teachers, feedback from other students, but also just trying out language out loud. So you can see these learners. Another key component of CLT is the idea that there should be collaboration among learners. There's this negotiation of understanding and speaking. So a lot of paired work, a lot of small group work really should be incorporated into the CLT classroom. Attempts to communicate in the target language are encouraged from the very beginning. There is, of course, time for learners to listen and demonstrate understanding before producing, but then early on in the classes, we're trying to have students start to incorporate language into their expression, into production, of course, with scaffolding from teachers. Activities are varied according to learners' preferences and needs, of course, but that emphasis is really on fluency. And so acceptable language use is the goal of instruction. So this slide shows us kind of a comparison between non-communicative activities and communicative activities. And so in non-communicative activities, for example, form is the focus, whereas in communicative activities, content is the focus. You can see that there's high teacher intervention in non-communicative activities compared to no teacher intervention or little teacher intervention in the communicative activities. And some of the activities that you might see in this classroom might be information gap activities, where one person has information that they have to learn from another learner, from another student. So for example, if you were discussing like your daily schedule, students would be paired to ask questions to classmates about, what classes do you have on Mondays and what activities do you have on Tuesdays? And what do you like to do on the weekend? And then taking notes on that and reporting back. Or with the idea of finding a time when they're both free in their schedules so that they can meet and have coffee or get together. There's also some idea of bringing language learners outside the classroom or bringing L2 speakers into the classroom. So that's a nice idea of kind of expanding the walls of the classroom. And again, making that language learning really authentic and purposeful, not just for the sake of, the worksheet or for the grade from the teacher, but it really is with the focus of communicating. So just to review the current teaching methodology that we talk about and that we'll want to see in your own micro-teaching example is focusing on these characteristics. The first one is exposure to language. So students really need rich exposure to language. We know that it needs to be comprehensible input. So if you remember, that's I+1, just slightly stretching the students beyond their current level of proficiency, but not overwhelming the learner to the point where they would shut down or get too frustrated. So that's the next one, input. Students need comprehensible input, but this is not enough by itself. So they also need some opportunities for noticing, or what we call consciousness raising. So a lot of times we'll have to bring students' attention to an aspect of language, a grammatical component that they might be focusing on that they're missing. So, it's not that grammar is absent from this methodology, not at all, but it is second to that goal of communicating. Remember that CLT is really based upon expressing real ideas, preferences, desires, likes, dislikes, etc., experiences that they've had in the past or experiences they want to have in the future. And it's contextualized whenever possible. It should be contextualized in real possible experiences in the target culture. So let's say that you were teaching abroad, let's just say in Spain, for example, and you wanted to teach about schedules in the US. Well, you would talk about, you would set up that context around, let's say, a college student's schedule living in the United States, which might be distinct from that of a Spanish speaking or a Spanish student going to university. For example, there's differences in living in a dorm compared to living at home with their parents. Also, CLT always has in mind lowering the affective filter. Anxiety really needs to be lowered as much as possible. So making sure that students feel comfortable taking risks with language, trying out new things, collaborating with classmates, asking for help, and expressing ideas, especially if they run into a barrier. And then finally, there's this aspect of discovery. This is something we haven't touched on yet, but students should be encouraged to discover things for themselves. So whenever possible, we prefer the inductive model of learning grammar, for example, rather than being explicit about the grammar rules. So you might ask students what they notice about particular examples of, let's say, like past tense in a passage from a book or from a paragraph, and see if they can start to draw some inferences about the use of the past tense. But whenever possible, we want students to have that experience of discovery and learning what the rules are for themselves. Okay, so finally, a reminder, we'll talk about this a little bit more later in our course, but as any practitioner knows, you have to constantly learn and refine your methodology. You have to reflect upon what worked well and what maybe needed some modifying. So just always being reflective and critical to constantly assess and review the needs of students, and then to accommodate that as much as possible. All right, thank you all for your attention during this PowerPoint presentation. Thank you for making it to the end, and I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation. Take care. Bye-bye.